Hello, my name is Abigail and welcome back to Polyglot Progress. One of my go-to resources when I'm a beginner in a language is textbooks, especially those that are targeted at self-learners like the Teach Yourself books or the Colloquial books. I know some people prefer to just dive right into immersion as soon as they start learning a language, but I am not one of those people. I've personally found that a textbook can really help me build a good foundation in a language through giving me the vocabulary and the grammar that I need to very basically express myself and understand what's going on, which then allows me to work on improving the language through using comprehensible input or through talking with someone. And so today, as requested by Francesca, I am just going to go through my process and my approach when it comes to working through textbooks. This is mainly going to be based on what I do when I am a beginner in a language, because that is when I tend to rely the most heavily on textbooks. But it's not that much different from how I would approach going back and using a textbook to review a tricky grammar point or something like that at a higher level. And as always, when it comes to these kinds of things, just a few quick disclaimers. The first one being that this is the approach that works the best for me, but that doesn't mean that it is the only approach out there that works well, and it definitely doesn't mean that this is the best or the only approach for you. I like to share what works well for me in language learning because I feel like videos of other people's language learning approaches and experiences have helped shape a lot of what I do now and have found really successful. But I've only figured out what has become successful for me by trying those things out and then adapting them and throwing a lot of them away. There's no one way to learn a language, and we are all very different people who learn very differently, so what works really well for me might not work really well for you. And then the other disclaimer is that this is how I approach working through textbooks. So this is what I do most of the time, and this is how I always kind of intend to go into a textbook, but it doesn't necessarily always happen exactly like this. I adapt based on my study session that day. I adapt based on my level, based on the textbook, and just my overall needs when it comes to that day and that language. Okay, so the first thing that happens when I open up to a new chapter is if the book, like the Colloquial series, starts off with a dialogue, I will listen to that audio without reading along. I focus just on listening, and I really try to understand as much as I possibly can just through that listen through. But inevitably, I don't understand everything because a lot of the words or grammar points are brand new and introduced in that chapter, so I go through it a second time. During the second pass through, I read through the written version of the dialogue, so I use the transcript, and if there's a translation provided, the translation, to go through and understand anything that maybe I didn't get because of my listening comprehension or because I didn't know the phrase or word. If I'm in a situation that allows it, I'll also do this out loud so that way I can get practice reading the dialogue out, and if I'm not in a situation that allows it, like if I'm out in public, I'll usually kind of mutter it along to myself. I won't make any sound, but I'll kind of mouth out the words just to give myself as much practice with speaking it as I can. If I don't end up understanding part of it, even on the second pass through, I really don't stress about it too much. I really view this part as more of a primer to get ready for what the material is in the chapter, as opposed to a thing where I have to absolutely understand 100% of it immediately. The vocabulary and grammar from the dialogue is going to be introduced later on in the chapter, so this is more for exposure to the material and just to kind of get myself ready to think about those things and see the way they can be used before I start studying them. And that's the same approach I have for every dialogue that's given in those books. Sometimes there will be a dialogue like halfway through the chapter. I do it exactly the same way. But after that initial audio, I go just in the exact order of the chapter. So if there's a dialogue and then an exercise and then a vocabulary list and then an exercise, I'll go in that order. I don't go through and do all of the exercises in one go or anything like that. When it comes to vocabulary sections, I write down pretty much every word, and I don't do this in any sort of organized manner. It is just a list. I start off by just writing down every single word in the list in my target language alone, and then I go back for a second pass where I start to quiz myself on that vocabulary as I write in the translation. I then go back for a third pass where I again quiz myself on the vocabulary as I highlight the word in my target language. The highlighting doesn't have too much of a purpose other than to help me be able to immediately recognize which word is in my target language and which word is in my native language. It just makes the page a little bit easier to read. But when I'm done with the vocabulary list, I'm probably done with it forever. I don't use my notebooks or my vocabulary lists or any of those things usually as reference materials or things to study off of. The only reason I write down the full vocabulary list is because I find that writing things down and having those multiple passes through where I quiz myself on the vocabulary really helps to make it stick. So it's really more of an exercise for myself to help myself learn vocabulary as opposed to notes that I'm going to use to learn the language at another time. As a result of that, there also is obviously not context given in these lists. They are just lists just to practice learning the vocabulary words themselves. But I'm not entirely learning these words out of context. I account for that in other ways. So for one, I feel like the textbook provides a little bit of context. Usually new words are introduced because they've been used in that dialogue from the beginning, or they're used in a reading exercise later on. So I am getting to see them used in sentences and understand when and why they would be used. Plus, this won't be the last time that I ever see or use these words. I'll continue to see them as I read and watch things and speak. Also, as I said, I write down almost every word. So I do sometimes skip words. Like I said, I'm most frequently using textbooks at a beginner level. So the way that I see it is for some of these words that I don't foresee myself using maybe ever, but at least not until I'm at an advanced level, I will skip over. I feel like it's just taking time from building that foundation in the language. I can always learn those words again later on. When it comes to the introduction of new grammar points, I also take notes. How I go about taking my grammar notes kind of depends on what the grammar point is, but for the most part, I take really thorough notes. I can go back and reference the textbook, but as you'll hear later on, I don't necessarily always keep the textbooks after I finish them. So I prefer to have a decent reference in my notebook. That is one part that I do go back and reference. The hope is obviously that I won't need to go back and reference it very long because it will become something that I'm using naturally and understanding and not making mistakes with. But as I initially kind of learn grammar points, especially when it comes to new tenses or things like that, I do like to have a reference. So having it in my notebook is quite helpful, mainly because I can write things down in my own words or condense certain things that are in the textbook. So although a lot of it is just the same information as from the book, it's in a way that my brain can maybe synthesize a little bit faster. And then exercises. I try to do pretty much every exercise. This doesn't always happen. Sometimes it depends on my study session, and sometimes I decide that I want to kind of make up an exercise for myself to do instead that might work a little bit better. But for the most part, if I think it's going to be helpful, I really try to do all of the exercises. That said, I do sometimes just skip exercises. There are some types of exercises that I do not find helpful at all. For example, I skip every single exercise in the section at the beginning of the book related to the alphabet, whether that's with a new writing system and practicing writing certain words or reading out sort of cognates in the new writing system. I just don't find exercises specifically related to that helpful at all. I have a video I made a few years ago about how I learn writing systems, and in it I talk a bit about how I like to just kind of dive right in and force myself to do other exercises and learn through doing. So I don't use exercises that are dedicated just to that at all. I skip over them. I see if there's any new words that I can learn, and then other than that, I just go. I also don't like and will always skip over word searches, crosswords, any of those kind of vocabulary exercises, fill in the blanks. Learning vocabulary for me is all about just learning that word and the sound that it has and the way that it looks and associating that with the meaning of it so that way I can understand it in context and I can use it to express myself. And finding it in a word search does not help with that. Visualizing words as I quiz myself on them and going through and seeing them while I read and I listen to things and making those connections is what's going to help me. Exercises are not. I try to make the most of textbooks. I do pretty much every exercise, like I said. I take notes on things, but I won't do work just for the sake of doing work and do exercises just for the sake of doing them, only if they're going to help me. Grammar exercises, though, I almost always do. Obviously, if I have already learned a grammar point and this is sort of review and I'm getting every single answer correct and that sort of thing, I might start to skip some or only do 1 or 2 answers from each exercise and double check that I'm still getting it right. But in general, I have found that I just cannot learn grammar through reading or watching things or things like that. I can't learn just by speaking. so I do drills. The repetition and intentionality behind constantly conjugating things in a new tense or making things agree to the gender or be in the right case or things like that really helps my brain to just wrap itself around the new grammar point and really solidify it. So assuming it is a new grammar point or something that maybe I previously struggled with, so now I'm coming back to a textbook to work on, I really will do pretty much every exercise and check over all of the answers for those. Sometimes I'll do this in my notebook, and oftentimes I'll just do this on a little mini whiteboard and whiteboard the answers. Again, it's not really for me to reference. I'm not intending to come back and look at these things, and especially with these grammar exercises, I really am not looking to memorize these phrases. I just need that repetition of using the same grammar point over and over again, and then I'm able to use it without thinking about it, or I can recognize it when I'm reading. So if it all gets erased after that study session from the whiteboard, that's totally fine. I don't need it. It's the act of doing it that's really important to me. If I notice that I'm doing really well with an exercise, maybe I've gone over this previously with a tutor, I will skip some of the exercises. And on the other hand, if I notice that I'm really just not getting most answers correct with the exercises and I'm really struggling to grasp a new grammar point, I will go back and relearn the grammar point and kind of figure out what it is that's so confusing to me and why I seem to be getting it wrong. And then I will do more exercises. Usually I won't use the same ones I did previously. I'll look up new exercises online or maybe make some sample sentences for myself. And once I feel like I have a good hold on that grammar point, once I feel like I can use that in a conversation with a tutor, then I'll move on. Depending on how much of the information in that chapter of the textbook was new, I usually will only work through one, maybe two if the first chapter was a lot of review chapters at a time. After I get through a chapter of the textbook, I will do some sort of activity to work on using the information I just learned through output. Most often this is in writing, so I'll take the new vocabulary that I learned, any new grammar that I learned, and I will write a journal entry or an essay or a short story using that information. Sometimes if I don't feel like writing a full thing, I'll just make sample sentences using the grammar points that I learned in the vocabulary. But this doesn't happen very often. I honestly find sample or example sentences, whatever you want to call them, very tedious and boring. I really hate doing them. So most of the time I just find something that I am interested in writing about and I write a whole thing and make those sentences in the context of whatever I'm writing about. I also might instead speak to myself or speak with a tutor using those new words and new grammar points, but I feel like most of the time my study sessions that involve a textbook are kind of a nice, quiet, solitary time for me, so I usually prefer to do some sort of writing exercise. But the really critical thing here is just that I find some way to use all of the words, all of the grammar that I just learned in the context of the ways that I would use it when speaking or when writing in that language. Working through a textbook is not just about getting that information, taking notes, doing some exercises and moving on. I want to make sure that that information is things that have stuck in my head and will just be usable in real life settings. So turning it into a written piece or speaking about it a little bit helps to kind of take it out of the context of just the book and put it into the context of my life. And then the next time I just move on. I don't tend to repeat chapters. I don't tend to go back and listen to audios again. I don't tend to reference my notes. I just feel like if there is something that I haven't 100% solidified at the end of that chapter, it's okay because it's going to come up again in future chapters or in the things that I read or the things that I say to my tutors or the things that I watch. I might rely on a textbook when I'm just starting out in a language, but it's not the only thing that I do when I'm starting out in a language. So what I learn in the textbook does not exist in a vacuum. I'm using those words in other contexts. I'm using them and memorizing them outside of just that chapter. I definitely could do things like making a memorized deck with the vocabulary I learn in each chapter, but honestly, I've found that my kind of 3 passes through writing it down and using it in exercises and seeing it in the context of the rest of the chapter really is enough foundation for me to be able to go off and use it and recognize it in other settings. And quite similarly, once I finish a textbook, I almost never go back and redo it. I will hold on to textbooks that I feel like I might reference, things that maybe I really enjoyed or things like that. And I'll also usually hold on to textbooks I feel like I might review for Polyglot Progress for a little while, but it's usually with the intention of getting rid of it after I review it. And other than that, I usually feel like once I've finished a textbook, I have finished that textbook. Hopefully through doing the exercises and learning the vocabulary, I feel like I've gotten everything I can out of it. So it just makes sense that instead of holding on to it and having it take up space on my shelves, I give it to someone who is maybe just getting started in the language or will be able to make more use out of it than I can. And yeah, that's about it. It's really not the most innovative or glamorous way of working through a textbook, but it works really, really well for me. And I know a lot of how I figured out what works well for me is through listening to what works well for other people and trying that out. So I hope that this more detailed video on how I work through textbooks either gave you some ideas for how you can work through them, or at least was some interesting insight into how I study. If you also enjoy using textbooks, I would love to hear your approach and how you tend to work through a chapter or work through the whole textbook. I will see you next Wednesday, and remember, practice makes progress.